The eldest son got the house, the business, and the lakefront property. The youngest daughter got the car and the savings account, and Nolan Hayes, the middle child, the one who had spent the last 4 years driving his father to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday, who had quietly paid the hydro bill when the old man was too proud to ask. Nolan Hayes, 38 years old, received a cracked leather wristwatch that didn't work. They laughed about it, not out loud, not with their mouths. But Nolan saw it in the way his brother Raymond's shoulders relaxed when the notary finished reading. He saw it in the small, satisfied exhale that his sister Pamela let out, like she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally put it down. They got everything. He got a dead watch, and from across the long dining room table of his father's Muskoka cottage, the cottage he would now have to vacate within 60 days because Raymond owned it, his sister-in-law Gail caught his eye and gave him the smallest, most deliberate smile he had ever seen on a human face. He would remember that smile for a very long time. The name on the watch face was Longines. The leather strap was cracked along the inside, the kind of dry splitting that happens when something hasn't been worn in decades. The crystal was scratched, and the second hand sat frozen at the 7. Nolan had turned it over in his hands in the parking lot of the notary's office in Huntsville, sitting in his 2009 Civic with the heat running because it was February, and Northern Ontario in February does not forgive. He looked at it the way you look at something that has just insulted you. He almost put it in the glove compartment. He almost left it on the seat. Instead, for a reason he couldn't name, he slipped it into his jacket pocket. His father, Gordon Edwin Hayes, had died at 71 after 2.5 years of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was not a warm man. He was not a cruel man either. Not exactly. But he belonged to that particular generation that expressed love through presence rather than words, through showing up at your hockey games and fixing your car in the driveway rather than through any kind of direct acknowledgement that you mattered to him. He ran a small landscaping and snowplowing company out of Bracebridge for 30 years. He was respected in the community. He was the kind of man other men described as solid. Nolan had come back to Bracebridge 4 years ago from Toronto, where he'd been working as a project coordinator for a mid-size construction firm. He had come back because his mother called him one Sunday evening and said, quietly, like she was ashamed of it, that Gordon had gotten some bad news from the doctor, and she didn't think she could manage the appointments alone. His mother, Elaine, had her own health issues. Moderate COPD, she tired easily. Nolan was the only one of the 3 kids without children yet, without a mortgage in another city, without what Raymond always called obligations. So Nolan came back. He worked remotely when he could, picked up contract work when he couldn't. He drove his father to the cancer center in Barrie every Tuesday and Thursday for months. Then the protocols changed and it became every week. Then it became more complex, more specialized. And Nolan became, without anyone formally appointing him, the person who managed everything. The medication schedules, the insurance paperwork. The conversations with the oncologist that Gordon was too frightened and too proud to ask questions in. Nolan asked the questions. Nolan wrote down the answers in a notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Raymond, who lived in Oakville and ran a financial planning practice, came up for 4 days at Christmas and 2 weekends in the summer. Pamela, who lived in Calgary with her husband and 3 kids, called every Sunday and sent a Sobeys gift card at Easter. They were not bad people. They were busy people. But there is a specific kind of loneliness in being the one who stayed, and Nolan felt it every single Tuesday on the drive up Highway 400, his father asleep in the passenger seat with his wool cap pulled down over his ears, and the radio playing old country songs neither of them talked about liking. Gordon died in November. The funeral was well attended. Raymond gave the eulogy and it was good, genuinely good, and Nolan sat in the front pew and thought, with a kind of exhausted fairness, that Raymond had always been better at words. He did not begrudge him that. What he did not expect was the will. He had not expected to inherit the cottage. He understood that. Raymond had 3 kids and a larger family need. He had not expected the landscaping business either. It was winding down more debt than asset at this point. He had assumed quietly that there would be something. Not as payment, not as transaction, but as acknowledgement, as some small signal from his father that the Tuesday drives and the Thursday drives and the 4 years of being quietly, consistently present had registered somewhere. Instead, he got a watch that didn't work. The notary, a compact, careful man named Douglas Ferreira, had read the bequest in the same measured tone he'd used for everything else. To my son Nolan, I leave the Longines wristwatch that belonged to my own father, Harold James Hayes, with the instruction that he have it serviced and wear it in good health. That was it. Ferreira had looked up from the document only briefly, and in that brief look Nolan thought he saw something. Not pity exactly, but a careful, deliberate neutrality that felt like it was containing something else. Nolan had wanted to ask about it. He hadn't. Raymond was already talking about the cottage, about getting a real estate agent in to assess it before the spring market, about what they would do with the furniture. Pamela was on her phone. Gail was smiling at him. He drove back to the 2-bedroom apartment he was renting on Manitoba Street and sat at his kitchen table with the watch in front of him and a cup of tea he forgot to drink until it went cold. He was 38 years old. He had spent 4 years in a town he'd left, working contract jobs below his skill level, sleeping in a rental that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's dog. He had no savings to speak of, because Bracebridge had not been lucrative, and because there had been months, more than he'd admitted to anyone, when he'd quietly covered things his father hadn't asked him to cover. A new water heater for the house, a gap in the extended health coverage for a medication that wasn't fully reimbursed. Small things. The kind of things you do because they need doing, and because no one else is looking. He was not bitter. He was trying very hard not to be bitter. He picked up the watch. He turned it over again. On the back, engraved in small clean letters that had softened with age. HJH. 1962. His grandfather Harold, a man Nolan had met twice, both times before he was old enough to remember clearly. He put the watch down, pressed his palms flat on the table, and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he thought, well, get it serviced. That was the instruction. So he would do that. There was a watchmaker on Dominion Street, an older man named Augusto Pellegrini, who had run a small repair shop out of the front room of his house for over 40 years. Nolan had driven past it 100 times. He brought the Longines in on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the reading of the will, because he'd needed 2 weeks to feel ready for even that small errand. Pellegrini took the watch, turned it under his loop, and said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. Then he said, in the careful English of a man who'd learned it as a second language and treated it with more respect than most native speakers, "Where did you get this?" "It was my grandfather's. It came to me through my father's estate." Pellegrini set down the loop. He looked at Nolan with an expression that was difficult to read. Not suspicion, not quite wonder. Something between them. "Do you know what this is?" "It's a Longines. 1962, I think, from the engravers of Longines. Cal. 30Z. Manual wind, 18 jewel movement." Pellegrini paused. "This is a very fine watch, Mr. Hayes. These were not common. Your grandfather had particular taste." He turned it over in his hands again, and then he did something unexpected. He pressed gently along the edge of the case back, just below the crown, in a spot that looked no different from the rest of the casing. There was a soft, precise click. The case back released. Pellegrini leaned back slightly to give Nolan room to look. Nolan leaned forward. The movement inside was visible, the small wheels and springs that had been sitting frozen for decades. But that wasn't what Pellegrini was pointing at. Fitted into the shallow lip between the movement and the case back, so precisely that it was invisible unless you knew to look, was a thin piece of folded paper. The kind of thin, waxy paper that feels almost like fabric, rolled to near nothing and sealed with what had once been wax. Nolan looked up. Pellegrini said simply, "Your grandfather knew his watchmakers." Nolan's hands were not steady when he unrolled the paper at Pellegrini's workbench, the older man politely turning away to give him privacy. The handwriting was not his grandfather's. He'd seen Harold's signature on an old Christmas card his mother had once shown him, a bold looping cursive. This was his father's writing. Sharp, spare, left-leaning. Gordon's handwriting. Nolan, if you are reading this, you did what I expected of you. You got the watch fixed. You followed through. You always follow through. I never said it properly. I'm saying it now. I know what the will looks like. I need you to understand that I wrote it that way deliberately, and I need you to understand why. Raymond and Pamela cannot know about this yet. Gail especially cannot know. Your brother is a good man, but he listens to that woman in ways that have cost him his own judgment, and what I am about to tell you requires someone with judgment. When your mother and I bought the lot on Lake Vernon in 1987, we bought 2 lots. The second one, the strip of land along the north shoreline, about 3 acres. I transferred separately 30 years ago to a numbered company your grandfather Harold set up before he died. That company has been sitting dormant ever since, legally held by his estate, which was never properly wound down because Harold didn't trust lawyers, and neither, if I'm honest, did I for a long time. The company is called AIN 7692 Ontario Limited. Harold's solicitor, a man named R.C. Dunmore, handled it. Dunmore retired, but his firm, Dunmore Aldgate, is still in Bracebridge on Main Street. Go see them, tell them Gordon Hayes sent you, show them the watch. They'll know what it means. The north lot is not in my estate. It was never in my estate. Raymond doesn't know it exists. The assessment from 2019, which you'll find in the company records, put it at $1.1 million. Lakefront in Muskoka has only gone in one direction since then. There is also a storage unit on Ecclestone Drive, Unit 14. The combination is the year on the watch back, plus the month your mother and I married, which you know. Inside is a fireproof case. Inside the case is everything you'll need. The company registration, the land title, your grandfather Harold's original will, and a letter from me to the firm that explains the chain of transfer. It's all in order. I had a lawyer I trusted go over it. Not Dunmore. A woman in Barrie named Kathleen Osey, and her number is in the case. You stayed. You drove me. You asked the questions I was too proud to ask myself, and you wrote down the answers in that notebook, and I watched you do it every single time, and I did not say what it meant to me because I did not know how. I am sorry for that. I am sorry it took me this long to learn how to say it. Wear the watch. Love. Dad Nolan stood at the workbench for a long time without moving. Pellegrini was at the far end of the room, his back turned, very deliberately making himself busy with something that didn't need doing. It was the line about the notebook that undid him. He hadn't known his father had noticed the notebook. He hadn't done it for his father to notice. He had done it because the oncologist spoke quickly and in a vocabulary that required translation, and someone needed to hold on to the information. He had done it because his father was frightened, even if he would never say so, and because frightened people deserve to have someone write things down for them. He set the letter on the workbench and pressed both palms flat and looked at the grain of the wood until he had himself back. "Mr. Can you fix it?" Pellegrini turned around. He looked at Nolan's face and asked no questions. "The movement is sound. It needs a full service. Cleaning, lubrication, timing adjustment. 1 week, a pause. It will keep good time after that." The storage unit on Ecclestone Drive was exactly where it was supposed to be. The combination worked on the second try. Nolan had briefly blanked on his parents' anniversary month, and then remembered, of course, June, a fact so embedded in his childhood he'd temporarily lost it under the weight of everything else. The fireproof case was grey and unremarkable, the kind sold at any Canadian tire. Inside was everything his father had promised. Folders, organized with the quiet precision of a man who spent 30 years managing routes and schedules. A man who knew that the difference between a job done and a job done right was whether you'd written it down. Kathleen Osey's card was clipped to the top of the first folder with a binder clip. Nolan sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit and called her from his cell phone. She picked up on the third ring. "Kathleen Osey speaking." Ems, OC, my name is Nolan Hayes. My father was Gordon Hayes. He told me to call you. A brief silence. Then Nolan. Yes, I've been expecting this call. I'm very sorry for your loss. Her voice was precise and warm in equal measure, the voice of someone who had learned to deliver difficult things without making them smaller than they were. Are you somewhere you can talk? He looked around the empty storage unit, the grey walls, the single fluorescent tube overhead. I'm in a storage unit in Bracebridge. That sounds about right, she said. Gordon told me you'd probably go straight there, and he could hear, just slightly, something that might have been a smile at the edge of her voice. Kathleen had been Gordon's lawyer for the last 3 years of his life, overlapping almost exactly with Nolan's return to Bracebridge, though Nolan hadn't known she existed. She had, at Gordon's direction, structured the dormant company transfer to survive probate without appearing in the estate. It was not complicated, legally. It had simply required someone meticulous, someone who understood what Gordon was protecting and why. He was very clear that your brother and sister were not to know until the transfer was complete and registered. He was worried, not about Raymond specifically, but about influence. His word. He used it twice in our meetings. Influence. Nolan thought about Gail and her small, deliberate smile and said nothing. It took 11 days. Dunmore Aldgate confirmed the company registration and the chain of title without any issues. The junior partner who handled it, a young woman named Priya Venkataraman, had found the dormant file in the firm's archive and called Kathleen directly after Nolan's visit, and the two of them had coordinated the registration transfer with an efficiency that felt, to Nolan, almost dreamlike. On the 11th day, Kathleen called him at 7:45 in the morning. It's registered, she said. 847692 Ontario Limited is now held solely by you. The north lot on Lake Vernon is yours. He was standing in his kitchen on Manitoba Street with a cup of coffee. He set the cup down carefully. What does the current market look like? He asked. Kathleen had already spoken to an agent she trusted. Not from Bracebridge, from Huntsville, specifically to avoid anyone who might know the family. The assessment had come back the previous afternoon. Lakefront in Muskoka, north-facing, 3 acres with road access and dock rights. $1.87 million. Conservative estimate given current demand. Nolan sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he had sat 2 weeks after the will reading with a cold cup of tea, and stayed there for a while, not moving. He was not going to sell it yet. Kathleen had advised patience, and he agreed. What he was going to do first, before anything, was call his mother. Elaine had known. Not everything. Gordon hadn't told her the specific amounts or the mechanics of the company's structure, because Gordon believed in protecting people from information that would require them to act on it. But she had known that he had done something. He told me, she said on the phone, crying in the quiet way she cried, which was almost soundless, that he had taken care of you. That you would understand eventually, he said. Nolan will understand because Nolan always follows through. She'd been carrying that for 4 months, since before he died. Nolan drove to her house on Taylor Road and sat with her for 3 hours. And they had the kind of conversation that families sometimes only manage to have after someone is gone. Direct, unhurried, honest about what had been hard and what had been worth it. His mother told him things about his father that he hadn't known, the way a person can live alongside someone for decades and still only know their outline. She told him that Gordon had watched Nolan drive away every Tuesday morning from the front window of the house, and that he had once said to her, quietly, that he didn't deserve a son who showed up like that, and that he didn't know how to tell him. Nolan did not say anything for a long time after that. Then he said, he told me, in the letter he told me. Elaine reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. Good, she said. Good. 6 weeks later, Raymond called. He'd been trying to reach Nolan about the cottage sale. There had been some interest, a young family from Toronto, reasonable offer. Did Nolan want to weigh in even though he wasn't technically a stakeholder? And Nolan had been slow returning the call, not out of avoidance, but out of a genuine uncertainty about what tone to take. He settled on neutral. Helpful. He told Raymond the offer sounded reasonable, and that he hoped the process went smoothly. Raymond mentioned in passing that he was planning to have the North Shoreline assessed for possible dock extension as part of the cottage sale package. That strip along the north side past the tree line. Dad always said it was Crown land, but I want to confirm before we represent anything to the buyers. There was a brief silence on the phone. It's not Crown land, Nolan said. What? The north lot, it's not Crown land. It was Grandpa Harold's. It transferred to a numbered company 30 years ago. A pause. Dad left it to me. The silence on Raymond's end was long and specific. Nolan waited it out. That's not in the estate documents, Raymond said finally. No, Nolan agreed. It wasn't part of his estate. Another silence. Gail is going to. Raymond started and then stopped himself. I know, Nolan said. He was not trying to wound anyone. He was simply stating what was true. Raymond, to his credit, gathered himself. He asked, after a moment, whether Nolan had spoken to a lawyer. Nolan said yes. Raymond asked if it was all properly documented. Nolan said yes. And then Raymond said something that Nolan had not expected. Not anger, not accusation, but something quieter, a little rougher around the edges. He should have told me he was doing this. I would have wanted to know. Nolan thought about that for a moment. About what Raymond would have done with the knowledge. About Gail, about influence, about a man who spent 30 years managing routes and schedules, and who had in his final years managed one last thing with the same quiet precision. I think he was protecting you too, Nolan said. In his way. Raymond didn't respond to that, but he didn't argue with it either. The watch came back from Pellegrini on a grey Wednesday afternoon, serviced, regulated, keeping time with a quiet steadiness that felt almost uncanny after however many decades of silence. Pellegrini had cleaned the crystal until the scratch was barely visible. The leather strap he'd replaced with a dark brown cordovan that suited the case better than the original, he said, though he had saved the original in a small envelope in case Nolan wanted it. Nolan clasped it onto his wrist in the shop. It felt, unexpectedly, exactly right. He paid Pellegrini, thanked him, and walked out onto Dominion Street into the February cold. The sky was the flat white of a Muskoka winter, the kind of sky that gives nothing away. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and held his wrist up and looked at the watch, his grandfather Harold's watch, his father Gordon's watch, now his, and felt the second hand moving under the crystal. Steady, reliable, exactly on time. He had a phone call to make to Kathleen Osei about next steps. He had a lot of work ahead. Paperwork, decisions. Probably a difficult conversation or two that he wasn't looking forward to. He had an apartment that smelled like a stranger's dog and a contract job that was ending in March, and a future that had shifted very suddenly from one shape to another entirely. But he had the watch, and the watch was keeping perfect time. When Nolan stood on that Bracebridge sidewalk, nobody was watching. No cameras, no reporters, no moment of public triumph. Just a man in a winter jacket, checking the time on a watch that used to belong to his grandfather, in a town where he'd spent 4 years showing up quietly and asking no one to notice. Think about what you would have done, with the watch, with the letter, with those 11 days of waiting before the transfer came through. Would you have called Raymond immediately? Would you have sat on it? Would you have driven straight to your mother's house the way Nolan did? Or would you have needed more time? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Gordon writing that letter and slipping it behind the watch movement, knowing his son would be the one to finally take it in to get fixed, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about the things people leave behind and what they really mean.